Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, and welcome to New Books in Economics. I'm Peter Lawrenson, Associate Professor of Economics at the University of San Francisco. My guest today is Nicholas Borst. Nicholas is a Vice President and Director of China Research at Seafarer Capital Partners. He previously worked as a China analyst at the World Bank, the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. And his research and commentary have been featured in the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, and other major news media. Nick is here today to talk about his recently published book, The Bird and the Cage, China's Economic Contradictions. Nick, welcome.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks for having me.
So let's jump right into it. What is the big message of your book? There's lots of books about the economy and obviously, lots of things to cover, which you do very well, but what's the takeaway?
I wrote the book to address this sense of whiplash I think a lot of observers have about China. Particularly in the China economics community, where for a long time there was really the sense that, China is committed to opening and to reform and sort of run by technocrats with a thin veneer of communism on top. And then, obviously in DC and the rest of the US, that opinion changed almost 180, whereas China was suddenly, completely state-driven. The economy was orchestrated in all levels by the party and the government, and that China was on a very different path than we had thought they were. And so the motivation behind writing the book was first just to clear things up in my own mind, because I've sort of lived through these intellectual cycles, but to really go through the history of what the party and the government have been saying basically since the start of the reform era, of what their economic goals were, what they were pursuing, and that if those had changed over time. And so the big takeaway of the book from doing that is, I think there's a surprising degree of continuity in economic management over the decades in sort of reform and opening era China. And I think it's one that it's a style of economic management centered around trying to utilize the market to basically get the benefits of markets and reforms without letting them sort of swamp the party's control of the economy. And to me, when you look at economic policy through that framework, it illuminates quite a few things. And it also makes clear some of the real trade-offs and contradictions embedded in that policy, and why ultimately it's sort of, in my opinion, responsible for a lot of the economic problems China is currently facing.
Okay, so it's a coherent policy, but maybe one has systematic problems and can't necessarily be carried forward indefinitely. Okay, so why don't you first sort of give us the picture of, your book, you go back a fair ways, but just maybe focusing on kind of the maybe the post sort of the 1990s onward, kind of after the recovery from the Tiananmen Square incident, and all that, and how that kind of evolved through the 90s and 2000s, and then how you see the logic of that, and then talk about how, again, as you kind of alluded to, there's a general sense among a lot of people like, oh, Xi Jinping just kind of, he personally had a different way of doing things. It's all about his style, and he's comfortable with this, not with that. So he changed everything. So tell us what happened first, what's happening under Xi Jinping, and then the underlying logic of both.
Yeah, so the 90s are a quite interesting period because in many ways they're sort of the heyday of this supposed embrace of capitalism and opening up and letting the animal spirits run the Chinese economy. And first, as you mentioned, it's important to put it in perspective where reform almost dies after Tiananmen, and it really has to be resurrected by Deng and others. But then once it gets going in the 90s, it's sort of rip-roaring, and it's an era where, in many ways, the private sector is rapidly displacing large parts of the state sector. You have the burgeoning state-owned enterprise crisis throughout the 90s that really comes to a head at the end of the decade. And then the private sector is basically poised to displace state-owned enterprises out of a lot of different industries. And this, comes back to, in some ways, I think, a misinterpretation of some of the policies of that era, specifically around, grasp the large, let go of the small. Where when I go back and look at what was being said during that period by Jiang Zemin and others, the focus in a lot of analysis from the West of that period was, okay, this was an era where they really downsized the state sector. They laid off all these millions of SOE employees and, sort of a golden age for the private sector. But when I look at what they were saying and what they were trying to achieve during that period, it seems very much quite a different interpretation of, actually, they acknowledged the problems in the state sector, but they were trying to, in some ways, save the state sector by triaging it, by letting go the weaker parts, but also at the same time of, bolstering state-owned enterprises that were weak, amalgamating them into larger units, putting in new control mechanisms through SASIC and other ways, and really trying to prevent the state sector from being entirely displaced. And I think that goes to the heart of the balancing act that the book tries to talk about throughout this course of China's economic history of, yes, the party acknowledged the power and the necessity of reform and markets, but there was a continuing desire to buttress the power of state-owned enterprises, to not allow them to be completely displaced, and to, in fact, consolidate and strengthen their power in key emerging industries. So, it's not long after grasp the large, let go of the small, that you have Hu Jintao putting out policies around strategic emerging enterprises, industries, and really concentrated, focused efforts to have the state play a large role in those industries. So I think that's the background that in many ways sort of gets misinterpreted or looked at with rose-colored glasses of this supposed golden era of reform and opening and private sector advancement in China. From my point of view, was done sort of in irrespective of the state, where if you look at the state's agenda and what they were trying to achieve, it was actually really focused on preserving state-owned enterprises. And the private sector made strides during this period, but it was often they were moving into the gaps that were left open to them or inventing new industries wholesale. Not some sort of conscious top-down plan of we're going to actively remove SOEs from this sector and allow private companies to enter. So that's the background for the sort of pre-Xi era. One that's much more nuanced in terms of the level of economic reform and disruption that the party was willing to embrace. And then Xi, comes into power, and there's a large part of the book that tries to sort of reckon with why a lot of us got Xi wrong initially, including myself. And
actually, let me just go back to the sort of 90s, 2000s era. So and actually this kind of relates to also, so your approach with this book is to look at a lot of your actual party documents, or like how they actually talk about things. Is that right?
Yeah, party documents, but also company-specific case studies. And that sort of draws from background of my day job of, being an investment analyst and looking at a lot of Chinese companies. But I think you can really see a lot of these mechanisms of state control in the economy through the lens of looking at companies.
Right. So you're saying, so in the 90s, 2000s, your characterization of what was happening isn't necessarily that different, but you're saying, the grasp the large and let go of the small. So you use that phrase a few times just for people who don't study China. That was the idea, is holding on to the biggest state-owned enterprises and keeping them strong and close to the state. But then, releasing, I was working in China at the time, and there would just be like a brewery in every county with like terrible quality control and building material. Every business that succeeded slightly would have either already have an SOE that was in that business and just barely functioning and kept a lot kind of on life support by loans that never got repaid, or or there were a few really large businesses that were also on life support, but they were trying to save the things they viewed as essential, the steel mills and stuff like that. But you're saying they didn't really have any it was more like not caring about whether the private sector filled in these gaps, as opposed to thinking, oh, this will be done better by the private sector.
Yeah, I think it was a calculated view of if we want to maintain control over the economy, what parts of the economy do we actually need to have our hand on the lever, and what parts can we let go? And so that's part of the thinking around that policy is, yeah, we don't need to control every brewery in every province in China, or, small scale textile industries. We don't need to worry about that. Those aren't essential to government control. What is essential is control over the banks. And so there's a section of the book that really talks about that, even though there was this policy during the period to clean up the state banks, to bring in strategic foreign investors, to eventually list them in Hong Kong. The mechanisms of control were never really abandoned over the state banks. And I think that applies for a lot of different sort of so-called commanding heights industries of, yes, we can allow the private sector to sort of fill in the gaps around sort of the pillars of state control in the economy, but on those pillars, we can't let go. And we will try to utilize some of the impressive tools of market economies to make state-owned enterprises more efficient, run better, ultimately stronger. But we're not going to let go of our mechanisms of control over them. And the goal is not for those SOEs to ever be completely privatized.
Right. So it is different from like kind of a classical communism, right? They did give up on the idea of like, we are going to have control of every person's job and every, single thing in the economy, but still just saying that the key thing is to have strong state power in the economy, and what would be sort of the feasible way to have that. But what about like, one narrative is that like Zhu Rongji, who was the vice premier who was focusing on the economy at the time, in the 90s, that he was pushing for joining the WTO as a way to lock in sort of market-oriented reforms. So does that contradict your story, or do you see that differently? That seems like he kind of, at least the people who, like him in the West say, oh, that guy was so great. He wanted to do the WTO. He wanted to, have these market-oriented reforms, and he knew that this would make sure that the party couldn't backslide later.
Yeah, no, I think that narrative certainly has a lot of truth, that there was a sense that there was some resistance to a lot of these reforms, and that these external commitment mechanisms were powerful and binding in a way that would prevent that backsliding. So I wouldn't dispute that, but I would, again, characterize it from the perspective of, and this is something I think sometimes gets lost, is that the party believes in markets. They understand that markets are powerful tools, but it's a tool that has to be controlled very carefully. And, that goes back to the analogy of the bird in the cage that the book is named after, of, the bird needs enough space within the cage to be able to fly and to grow and be healthy. But that cage has to remain in place to make sure that the economy is being guided in the direction that the party wants. And so if you look at some of the quintessential reformers, or, the good guys from the perspective of economic reform in China, like Zhu Rongji, I think they do believe in the power of markets and the ability of markets to drive forward China's economic growth and ultimately feed into the country's economic power. But it's, at least from my reading, it's never an intention that the state is going to give up all levers of control, or that SOEs are going to be basically replaced by private companies. That's not the end goal. It's how can we use markets to make our economy grow faster and be more efficient while still retaining control over the parts of it that we think are important. And so that's how I would balance that message of, yes, they wanted to lock in reforms. They believed in a lot of these reforms, but they didn't believe in reform so much that they thought, the ultimate end state should be that these SOEs would be privatized and run along solely market terms.
Right. So I guess if you sort of look at it from the kind of statistics, or just kind of what was happening on the ground, the kind of directionality is the same under either theory, either the theory that they were reformers who were doing the best they could under political constraints, or the theory that they were, people who had, You can think of it as like if we think of like whatever 100% markets to 0% markets, they were always targeting 60%, but when you're at 30 moving towards 60%, you don't know just from watching the motion, you don't know whether the actual target is 60 or 100%. And we kind of convinced ourselves that they were going for 100%, sooner or later, but actually they had an end goal that was far short of what we would endorse.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that puts Xi in a lot of, the perspective that I see him of coming from that line of thinking of, yes, reforms are important. We need to embrace them, but never thinking that it was the end goal that I think a lot of Western economists and China analysts sort of attributed to them of, China eventually at some point might be a more or less capitalistic economy where the government has sort of a limited role and it's all technocratic. And I don't want to construct a straw man because I don't think anyone actually argued that to that extent. But there was this view of, they are on this path of trajectory where eventually the state will play a much smaller role in the economy. And I don't think that was ever the intention from Beijing. And I think that's demonstrated by both speeches and policies and some of the individual corporate actions that I analyze in the book. And so that makes Xi much less of a sharp discontinuity in the economic reform trajectory of China and much more in line with his predecessors of someone who understands the importance of the market and reforms, but also understands from the party's perspective the importance of maintaining levers of control in the economy.
Okay, but I think so. The general sense is not just that Xi Jinping called a halt to progress towards marketization, but in important ways reversed it. So why don't you talk us through, some of those policy changes and why you see those as consistent with the general framework you've put forward?
Yeah, so the book goes into a lot of detail about the early economic agenda of Xi in the third plenum and the excitement around that and, the focus on a lot of the reforms that were outlined in that document. And I think some of them were quite important and potentially significant for the economy. But there's also sort of a selective reading of that, where if you go through the document, there's still a lot about preserving state-owned enterprises and the role of the state. And, there's, Xi's supplemental analysis remarks that come out after the third plenum communique that goes into a lot more detail around that. And so even from that early period, I think it's clear to see that there's this balancing act where, Xi is in some ways open to more reform than his predecessors were, but also not abandoning this notion of we need to control key levers of the economy and preserve state-owned enterprises. And then, as I try to outline it in that third chapter of the book, this economic reform plan sort of gets completely derailed by events not long into his tenure. So you start with almost immediately, some real problems in the financial sector in terms of interbank instability, and then it sort of progresses into a pretty severe real estate slowdown. And then you have the stock market and currency blowups that happened in 2015, where, a lot of the reforms that were being pushed, essentially, I think kind of more or less blow up in Xi's face. And, China is beset by, a property market downturn, a stock market collapse, and then perhaps most worrying is, a mini currency crisis where, China is basically forced to spend around $1 trillion of reserves to defend the renminbi against huge Calpo outflows in 2015 and 2016. And it blows up in a very public and international way that can't be ignored. So I think that's part of the context of why Xi initially backtracks off some of the policy agenda that he first laid out. And I think that is more or less consistent with what many of his predecessors have done, of this ebb and flow of reform of, you push for reforms until a point where they start to create unintended consequences or negative outcomes that you're uncomfortable with, and then you sort of backtrack and consolidate. So there's this ebb and flow of opening, closing, loosening up, restricting that characterizes, basically China since the start of reform and opening in the 1970s. And I think initially Xi probably falls into that category pretty closely. So that's how I would kind of put the first half of Xi's at least initial 2 years in power, initial 2 terms in power. Is the first one is you sort of come in with lots of ideas about opening and reform and a pretty ambitious policy agenda that runs into some problems very quickly, and then there's sort of a recalibration and retrenchment after that.
Okay. So in your book, as you mentioned, you do go through a lot of case studies of specific businesses, which you know quite well. I think that can be really good for illustrating things. I know I had Ken Wilcox from Silicon Valley Bank here a few weeks back talking about his generally bad experience, which there I think is illustrating the point you made that the control of finance is crucial to the party, and that they have been talking about welcoming foreign finance in various ways for 20 or 30 years, but it's always been very, very incremental and dissatisfying, I think, for most of the participants. So that's kind of a little bit of a special case. But why don't you give us one or two of your favorite examples of kind of the corporate experiences that kind of show the points that you're making.
So there's I'll pick one that's a little bit earlier in Xi's tenure, and then we can the latter half of the book is all about kind of examples in the past few years. But I think this earlier one is sort of indicative of the direction that was going on, and that was the fight for control over banca, which was one of the key SOE developers in the sort of mid 2010s in China. And it was sort of an interesting company in that it was one of these partially privatized SOEs where they had listed and there were external shareholders, but the largest shareholder remains China Resources Group. And so in a way, they had adopted some market mechanisms and had tried to become more efficient, but also had this large state sort of keystone shareholder that was in many ways ensuring that this prized corporate asset, which at that point it was the largest property developer in China, remains under some degree of supervision and state control. And then it's a quite interesting case study because it was an example of when the private sector, I think, tried to push the line on what was acceptable and permitted in China. And, in the US, we have tales of, corporate raiders and private equity takeovers. And this was, part and parcel in a capitalist economy, but not really something that ever happened in China, at least to that point. And banca was the case study of whether that would be allowed. And so you had a series of outside private firms who were trying to take over banca through essentially, a hostile takeover, purchasing shares, trying to wrest control of this prized state asset from the state. And there's interesting tie-ins to the financial sector where some of the corporate suitors were kind of raising funds through shadow banking in order to try to take control of banca. But the long and short of it is they were essentially stopped dead in their tracks from doing so. The state stepped in quite directly and essentially said, no, this is going to remain a state asset. And actually, we're going to have an entity, it's actually the Shenzhen Metro, so very tightly connected to the government of Shenzhen, come in and be the dominant stakeholder of banca. And these private suitors that were trying to take control of Ivanka, you're going to be investigated. You're going to be banned from the securities industry. You're going to have to apologize for your actions. And essentially, you're going to have to give up and sell your stakes in this company. And so to me, this was a very interesting example of even before the narrative of, Xi really reversing course in theory and going in a more state direction, of clear limits being put on what the private sector could do in terms of taking over state assets or trying to displace state firms. And so they ran into a brick wall there. And I think that set a tone that kind of rippled across the rest of the economy.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's an excellent example of that, and certainly showing that, yeah, like it's not so much the reversal, but just setting clear limits of like you can do a lot more than you used to be able to, but there's only so far we'll let you go.
Yeah, they ran right into the cage.
Yes, right, exactly. Yes, they yeah. So okay, so thinking about the present, you highlighted three different key trade-offs that you think Xi and the party face in making economic policy. So you mentioned growth versus stability, innovation versus control, and global integration versus self-reliance. So why don't you give us kind of the key points on those and an example or two of each of those?
Sure. So yeah, this is the final part of the book, which is really, I think, an effort to try to understand how and why the party intervenes in the economy. And of course, you can only simplify things so much. There's no way to encapsulate every single economic decision. They're made for a million different reasons, but there were, three main drivers that really stood out to me. Is we want stability. So we want an economy that grows in a way that doesn't create financial or economic disruptions that could be threatening to the party. We want control, and that's a focus on, again, going back to these key levers of industry, commanding heights of the economy. How do we maintain our control over those different parts? And third is self-reliance, and obviously that's extremely relevant right now with the U.S.-China trade conflict and Xi's long-standing effort to reduce the ability of foreign countries to economically coerce, from their perspective, China into doing things it doesn't want. So I look at it, look at these economic interventions through the lens of these three different goals. And so I can, I'll go into a quick case study for each of them, just to sort of illustrate it. And then we can talk a little bit about kind of what the trade-offs are from that. So, on the stability side, I think there's a key example of this with the property market, of deep discomfort with the party, of the cycles and the volatility and the social stresses created by the property market, and especially the potential financial risks clustered around it with these large over-leveraged property developers. And so, for years, she has been talking about, housing is for living, not for speculation. And it all sort of reached a crescendo in the second half of 2020, where the party decides to intervene very directly in the housing market, very directly with the property developers. And the sort of most infamous policy from this time is the three red lines, where it's basically a series of financial controls put on the property developers. And it has this enormous impact on growth. So they end up basically forcing a hard deleveraging of all the property developers in sort of a chaotic way. It ripples out across the entire housing market. All of the large property developers, or almost all the large property developers, go bankrupt. Housing investment plummets. All the related industries are impacted. And so it's this idea that this real desire for stability has actually had a major impact on the country's growth, that they've pushed so hard for stability that they had this unintended consequence of really damaging growth. And so there's a couple of different case studies that go through similar lines, but the property market is the one that's just, we're now almost 5 years from the announcement of the three red lines, and we're still feeling the impact of that. So for the second example would be this idea of control and trying to control key industries and key levers of influence throughout the economy. And to me, the example of that stands out very directly for this is going back to what we talked about before, the financial sector. And so you have Ant Finance, which I think all the listeners will know is started as an affiliated company of Alibaba and was essentially the Chinese PayPal, but then grows into something much, much different and more ambitious. So they start with online payments, then they're offering consumer credit, SME credit, they're offering investment products. At one point, they have the largest money market fund in the world, and they offer their own consumer credit rating agency, something that was sort of lacking in China. And so you have this private company essentially creating an alternative financial ecosystem, one that directly competes with the state banks. And even though some of the state banks are sort of involved, they're basically bit players in the Ant financial ecosystem. And that, again, this company runs right smack into the cage of, they're riding high, they're scheduled for the world's largest IPO. And then mere days before that, it gets pulled. The company basically goes silent. Then it comes out that they've had a meeting with regulators and they're issuing self-criticism, and then they're getting investigated for all these things, ultimately having to restructure parts of their business, sell off parts of their business. Jack Ma goes from having a 53% ownership stake in Ant to a 6% ownership stake. And so this company basically gets its wings clipped and still exists, is still in many ways an impressive company, but certainly has had the scope of its business substantially reduced. And I think that goes directly into this idea of they were competing for control in a key sector.
So is it control for control's sake, or are there specific things? It would vary industry by industry of like why they want to control that sector, or what they worry would happen if it were just developing completely, in a laissez-faire kind of manner.
Yeah, I think the intermediation of credit throughout the economy has long been viewed as a focal point of economic control and influence. And you see it to this day. If you look at the annual reports of a lot of the state banks, they will openly talk about, their adherence to national policy objectives in terms of lending, like things like the Belt and Road. The state banks were basically falling over themselves to trump up how much support they were giving for the Belt and Road. We also see, the support for key emerging industries where credit is channeled from the state banks to those industries, and also sort of economic bailouts with the property market and other struggling sectors where the government more or less directs credit to help support these industries to prevent kind of worse economic outcomes. And so I think if you're focused on maintaining those levers of control, having a more market-based player like Ant is very threatening. You're not going to be able to direct Ant to bail out property developers or make loans to burgeoning semiconductor firms that you're trying to develop your own domestic semiconductor industry. It's just a lot harder to do that if it's a market-based private entity that you don't have control over. So that's why I think they've always pretty jealously defended control over the financial sector. And it's the reason why, 40, 50 years into reform, we still don't have really a large, truly private market-oriented bank in China.
Yeah, I suppose part of it is also like, you could, I'm just trying to think like what would be the kind of Western economist approach. We'd probably say, you should set up a policy bank that's designed to make the loans that are good for society, but not as profitable. But I think the challenge with that, and one that we face in the West too sometimes, is you set up that policy bank. The problem is if you only make, no one really wants to admit that the reason why the private sector doesn't want to make those loans is because they're not going to get the same return. So you don't want to admit that you're losing money. So there's often a desire to kind of camouflage that by, mixing it. So if you have only state banks, they can have good loans that are paying back, and those compensate for some of the less, the policy advised loans. But if you have a private sector coming in and taking over all the good loans, then you're really just be left with only the stuff that, at least from a financial perspective, is low quality. And then you have to, and again, I guess the Western approach would say, okay, well, if it's worth investing in these things, public goods or whatever, or policy objectives, then that's fine. You should just tax for it. But then that creates a different set of policies, sort of way to, I guess, going back to kind of like the old, what they used to call like financial repression. You keep everyone, just force them all to put their money in the banks, and then you can do, if there's only a few banks that exist, then you can do whatever you want with it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. If you essentially have a closed capital account like China, you have policies that really favor high savings rates. You have this huge pool of cheap savings that can't leave the country, that has limited channels to go to, and where most of it ends up is with the banks. And so that gives banks tremendous power to be able to extend credit on very cheap terms to preferred industries. And so I think that is quite a important way of controlling the economy in terms of promoting specific industries, but also sort of limiting disruption in industries that need extra support. And the idea that you mentioned, I think, is quite correct, is if you can sort of mix these market-based loans with these policy loans, maybe in the wash, the bank is still sort of self-financing and not needing constant injections of state capital. But I think we're sort of seeing real time of how far can that be pushed. And, the book goes into this a little bit about, but the SOE debt mess and the implications that had for the banks in the late 90s, basically China was able to grow its way out of that problem. And so these bad loans that were absolutely crushing in 1998, by the end of the 2010s, were a much smaller portion of the national balance sheet. So it's a policy that I think works very well in a rapidly growing economy, and one that's much tougher to envision going forward.
Yeah, I mean, everything's easier when your economy's booming, I guess. So Western trained economists have, when they've done studies of, they talk a lot about capital misallocation. They can see that like more capital is going to places that, have essentially a lower return on investment, or, are using it less effectively. And that's because of this financial system, restricts access to, doesn't give as much capital to, small businesses or startups or whatever, and directs it to, government approved projects or places that are employing a lot of people they don't want laid off. So because in the Chinese discourse on the economy that you're reading, like how much do they acknowledge that? Do they say, yes, we're putting it in less inefficient places, but it's important for society, or do they just kind of talk around it?
Yeah, I've never come across the, an explicit reference to we're going to allocate capital worse in.
Yeah. Doesn't sound very nice when you say it that way.
And, I think there's also, there's a natural tension too, where the banks and other financial entities have marketized enough to some extent where they're not always as willing participants for some of these endeavors as maybe the party would want them to be. Because ultimately they know when these loans go sour, the loan officer has to own up for the bad loans that they approved. But I do think it manifests through what I mentioned earlier of, these explicit recognition by the banks and commitment to supporting national policy objectives. And so it's not phrased in the sense of we're going to give credit to bad industries, but it's phrased in the sense of we need to stabilize the real estate sector because that's an important determinant of China's overall economic stability. And so there'll be, policies like the property developer whitelist, which is essentially a list of pre-approved developers that local governments and Beijing have gone through and said, okay, banks, you can loan to these property developers, and if the loans go bad, we're not going to hold you personally accountable for that. So that's sort of an example of directed lending towards a national objective. Or there's also these more sort of strategic objectives of supporting emerging industries or dual circulation, where banks and other financial institutions are explicitly saying, this is a national objective. We're going to, provide support for this. We're going to tout how much lending we've done each year for Belt and Road projects or other things like that. If you're standing outside of this, looking at it from a traditional economics perspective, you would say, well, if these industries are so great and so promising, you wouldn't have to have this top-down push to provide support to them, and you wouldn't have to have things like government guidance funds and things like that kind of sweeten the deal. But so I think it comes back to this understanding of if there's national goals that need to be supported, the banks, because they are still ultimately controlled by the government and the party, will follow those national goals. But they're also not going to explicitly say that we're lending to bad borrowers who couldn't otherwise get credit. We're going to dress it up nicely and say this is part of this national strategic goal, and please laud us for supporting these goals.
Right. So then your third trade-off was global integration versus self-reliance. So definitely something we're thinking about a lot in the U.S. as well. So how has it played out in China?
Yeah, so I think if there's one area where Xi maybe does differ a little bit from his predecessors, it's that he came in very early on focused on this idea of economic self-reliance of China. They talk a lot about technological chokes and wanting to reduce the ability of foreign countries to basically pressure China. And so I think there's a whole series of different industries where we've seen this manifest, where there has been industrial planning or policy interventions or corporate restructuring with SOEs to basically consolidate control over an industry, where this is all being done in the name of China, being less reliant on the rest of the world to develop industries that are domestically driven, not reliant on foreign technology. And so one that kind of stands out to me and has been in the news a lot has been the automotive industry. And, very early on, earlier than the US and Europe, there was this real focus on developing an EV industry and lots of industrial planning related to that. And I think some of that planning comes actually out of a frustration where China has, for a long time, wanted a robust domestic auto industry, but really hadn't gotten there before EVs, had JVs with a lot of the big foreign players, but the domestic auto brands were not seen as particularly competitive. Maybe they were doing some really low-end exports to the rest of the developing world, but not, truly globally competitive players. And so even in the early 2010s, there's this push to develop a domestic EV industry, subsidies, tax incentives, research incentives, some policy programs that were really designed in a way that disadvantaged foreign players, essentially buying time and space for these nascent Chinese EV companies to get to scale, to become more competitive. And it worked. So I think, you might look at China's EV industry, and I think a lot of countries would be jealous of the success that they've achieved. And, in some ways, a gold standard of industrial planning, where China has multiple different globally competitive EV industries. Now, there's been a lot of waste and turmoil along the way. And, China at one point had 100+ EV companies. And I think that list each year narrows down, and we'll see how many ultimately survive. But at the end of the day, you would say, it's quite likely that China will have 2, 3, or 4 of the world's best EV companies. I think that the truth of that, though, is because it was done so overtly, in such a direct fashion with huge resources and support behind it, it's created a a response, a backlash globally to Chinese EVs that does have some significant drawbacks. So you see, not just in the U.S. and the U.S. had put a percent tariff on Chinese EVs under the Biden administration, so even before the current trade war, but also in Canada, the EU, Brazil, Turkey. The Indians basically have said we don't want any Chinese EVs entering our country, or even Chinese EV companies setting up factories in India. So there's this huge global backlash, I think, to the level of industrial planning that went behind creating this domestic industry in China, that it was viewed as unfair, kind of state-guided, disadvantaging foreign players. And I think that sort of trade-off plays out in a lot of different industries where China will take very direct, sometimes aggressive efforts to increase self-reliance in a specific sector of the economy. But that creates a corresponding backlash that I think undermines China's ability to stay as integrated in the global economy. And I think that's quite important for the country's growth.
Right. So just this last couple of things to talk about. One is kind of, like the big picture and going forward. So first of all, your job role, you're working for an investment company. So a lot of things you're saying, and there's a lot of these tensions, and China's economy has a lot of problems that the policymakers don't seem to be willing to, move past, or can't quite reconcile these trade-offs, all of which are kind of desirable in principle, but like they're going to make it harder to grow, and in many cases harder for foreigners to engage with their economy in whatever respect. So, so is your job as China analyst just to tell people not to go?
I'm always torn because my day job, is I go to China pretty frequently. I meet with Chinese companies, and I am consistently impressed with so many of the Chinese entrepreneurs out there, where, they're smart, they're capable, they're as sophisticated as anyone else out there. They're really trying to build dynamic, market-oriented companies, but they're operating in this framework, this overarching case on the economy that in some ways really limits their potential, or, depending on the industry, can limit their potential significantly. So, part of the reason behind writing this book was just to try to make sense of this a little bit for myself, of, what does this mean for your average Chinese company? And, it may not mean that much for a textile producer. If you're making apparel and you're a private company, Beijing probably does not see you as a key lever of economic control, and you can grow your business and, operate more or less unaffected. But for other industries, it matters a lot. So particularly if you're touching on one of these key levers of control, or something that has potentially national security, social security implications. So, I'm watching very closely some burgeoning industries in China, like AI, and basically how much room they have to grow and develop before, Beijing sort of reaches in and tries to take more direct control. So we'll have to see. And when you're doing this real time, you're sort of piecing through facts and rumors. But one of the stories that came out, and I think we still have to confirm it, was that DeepSeek had taken away all of the passports of its engineers to prevent them from leaving China. And so I would love to know, is that story true? And is there an active party committee in DeepSeek? And if we look at the history of intervention in different economies, you can see when a private company is developing quickly in a sensitive industry or in an influential industry, it's usually not long until the party will step in and try to exert greater control. And so in the form of AI and some other strategic emerging industries, I think we have real-time examples of watching that unfold, of to what extent they sort of try to rein these companies in, and what impact will that ultimately have on their businesses. Can they be as innovative as they would like to be if there's a party committee basically vetoing actions that they may take at the corporate level? Can AI develop as as rapidly as it should be able to. If the government is saying no, actually, we're worried about the economic and social implications of AI in certain industries. And then finally, can Chinese AI, which from the outside observer appears to be very competitive, basically nipping at the heels of OpenAI and the other big US players, if they are so tightly linked to the Chinese state, does that in some ways mortgage their future of the ability to grow overseas and to be used by, foreign companies and users if there's this concern that ultimately this is sort of a politically controlled entity? And so to bring it back to my day job and looking at companies, to me, it's a framework to try to understand and assess some of these risks. And you can't predict every risk from investing in China ahead of time. It's impossible. But I think this sort of gives me a map of trying to understand where some of the key tripwires might be and trying to be aware of those ahead of time.
Great. Well, I think that's a good point to wrap up on. So again, this is Nick Borst, and the title of the book is "The Bird and the Cage: China's Economic Contradictions." And definitely encourage anyone involved with China to go out and get a copy. It's a great, we didn't get too deep into the history, but it goes through a lot of the evolution of kind of the backstory of how we got where we are today. And as you said, traces out some continuities that people just kind of jumping in at in the past 10 years might not realize, as well as getting into these contradictions in the current economy and how they play out for specific companies. So thank you so much for your time, Nick. It's been a pleasure talking to you.